when you look at, let's say, Einstein or Darwin or Stephen King or folks, they tended to work maybe 4 or 5 hours a day. That turns out to be all you need to write The Shining or The Origin of Species or the Fifth Symphony. But those 4 or 5 hours have to be really, really intense, right? And as you work, as you develop, you don't try and stretch out the number of hours that you work. You make the peak higher so that you can focus even deeper.
Welcome to the More Business, More Life podcast. Today, I have a special guest, Alex Soojung-Kim Pang, and he is amazing. I read his book first, and I reached out, and I got him to come here, and I'm so excited because I've been talking about more business, more life for over a decade, 15 years now, trying to find the way to live a good life where you can have your profession, your career, and you can also have the other parts of your life, family, your hobbies, and all these things. And finding rest, his book, and reading, actually one of my cousins mailed it to me, and reading this, you're going to see in this episode, we're going to cover the data points and the stories that actually prove, without a doubt, that if you take rest as serious as you take your work, you're actually going to be more effective, you're actually going to enjoy your life more, and you're going to have a longer, more sustainable life where you don't actually have to retire. You could actually work well into your a later age, because you've rested well enough. You've taken care of, it's like taking care of a car, right? If you do the oil changes, it'll last a heck of a lot longer than if you never do it. So this and more, jump into this podcast. You're not going to miss it. We cover a lot of stuff, and it is profound. Thank you for being on the show, Alex. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, no, it's great to be with you. So
yeah, the way this all came about is that, I've been doing More Business, More Life for so many years. It's actually our trademark, and the whole thing is more business and more life. And it is that integration, not so much balance per se, but integration and how we design our life and our business and on purpose, right? And so many people don't do that. We know, you've probably seen this in all your research. They run for money or career, and they let their life sacrifice. Or there's other people that choose life and they let their whole career sacrifice. And so it's and then this comes to inviting you on the show, because with your book, Rest, really, and I'm going to even just read this here, why you get more done when you work less. And I've been saying for years, I always say, take more breaks and get more done. Like that. And so when my cousin mailed me your book and said, isn't this what you talk about, Steve? And then I read your book really quickly. It was like a page turner for me. So I'm like, yes. And so it is a privilege to sit with you and just to pull this out, because we're on the same mission, but we do it in different ways. So it is so cool to have this conversation for me.
Oh, great. No.
Yeah.
It's great for me too.
Okay, beautiful. Well, so your work around rest, so this comes back in. So the book Rest, just for everyone listening and you haven't met Alex, you are really diving into that we need to be as active in designing and doing our rest as much as we do our profession or our work or our career, or even say your passion, and you're putting those equal, and with that, the data you present in the book, then they're exceeding.
No, I think that's exactly right. That when we imagine what a successful life would be like, or a good life, there are some top lines. I think that being well known in your career, financial success, things of that sort. And you kind of assume that everything else will sort of take care of itself, number one. And number two, that the critical element of professional success or doing work that is meaningful is the number of hours that you put into it. And how much you are able to prioritize that over other things, which eventually you'll kind of make room for. And I think that it is, even incredibly smart people make the mistake of assuming that they can work this stuff out, or it'll just work itself out. And it turns out that you really do have to be intentional,
Yes.
both at the level of thinking about what kinds of choices will make for a good life over the span of years and decades, but even at the daily level, thinking about how to balance periods of work and rest and layer them so that you're able to end the day with the satisfaction of having done a really good day's work, but not feeling like that has absolutely exhausted you, right? There's a difference between leaving everything on the field and feeling like you have absolutely nothing left. And we can design our days and our lives to have more of the first rather than the second.
I love that. And there's so many things I want to ask about right there. So we're going to have to extrapolate it. But, that is one thing I think when I first started talking about more business, more life, people think about when their next big vacation they're going to plan, and they're thinking like a year. And I say something similar to what you say. And so I just want to highlight this and kind of echo it and maybe go deeper. But when we think in that way, then you do work yourself to exhaustion, and then that vacation is not even as meaningful for one. But then I always say, okay, well, what is it that you want out of that vacation? Then what can you do every month? What can you do every week? And what can you do every day? Because then you fractionalize it, right? And start thinking, okay, what am I going to do? So let's say, as an example, you want adventure. You want to put yourself in a new culture. So you want to go on a 3-week vacation, and you want to go to a new country you've never been to. Then I say, okay, well, how could you give a little bit of that every month? Maybe find a local restaurant, or find someone that knows that language, or sign up for a language class, or, different things that, just as an example, that you can bring into your daily life. And so I'm bringing this up big because you just said something that I think is really powerful that's highly overlooked, is how do you make it small? It's not the big vacation. It's resting every day, right?
Yes. I think that's really smart. I mean, I think that another element of the way that we often think about success is in terms of very big goals or big milestones. The 3-week vacation snorkeling in Bali, as opposed to and what that does is, while it certainly can be valuable to set big, ambitious targets. And as someone who is working on his proposal for his 6th book, that's a big target.
Right.
Every single one of those. But, I think that recognizing that there is still a lot of value in things that we can do on a daily basis that are not necessarily as unique as once in a lifetime as, that big trip, but still will provide pleasure and satisfaction and be restorative. That's actually that's an incredibly smart thing that a lot of people learn really the hard way. I've been doing looking at the lives of successful rock musicians for years, and one of the really interesting things is we now have a generation, basically the generation of musicians who recorded the stuff that I grew up with. Right? Who are now in their 60s or 70s, talking about the whole span of their careers. And the number of them who say that, it was cool to have sold millions of records, but there was a much bigger downside to immense success than I ever recognized when I was younger, number one. And number two, that they talk about the satisfactions of the craft and of practice, and of what you would imagine are daily things that would be trivial to someone who has played in front of 80,000 people. Being working in the garden, walking the dog. That kind of stuff turns out, even for people who have toured the world and won Grammys and so forth, that stuff stands out as what really matters. And that's something that's a lesson worth thinking about and putting into our own lives.
Because in that same way, here they are living that life, but they gave up parts of their life because it's like 100% overwork again, because you're on one bus to the next town, to the next plane, to the next country. And then again, it's another form of workaholic, being a workaholic. This happens in the film industry as well too, because you're bit by the star bug and you have that essence and you'll overwork. And that's why there's people that die in Hollywood on the 405 because they fall asleep at the wheel because they worked 16 hours to make a movie, and it's like exciting, but the human aspect gets deleted. I think in the entertainment industry, maybe it's one of the examples where as an entrepreneur, being myself, the passion is the delusion, right? Because you're so passionate about it, you're pouring in. So I'm just listening to what you're saying, because hearing this, it relates, because I went to film school. I don't know if I told you this, but I went to film school, and then I became a marketer, and then this whole career business came into my life. But I look at, film is riddled with workaholics.
No, and I think that there is very logically a desire to make hay while the sun shines, or sort of lots of people recognize that if you are a successful musician, that's not going to last, right? Peter Frampton had this line about how you can be a musician your entire life, you can be a pop star for about 18 months. And I think that there are some fields where sort of the nature of the market, the competition, or of all of, and sometimes just the excitement of of success means that it makes it very seductive. But I think that even in those fields, and definitely for all the rest of us, finding ways of working that allow us to do this stuff that we really love without it being an act of sort of self-sacrifice, but rather making it sustainable, that's like the great challenge that we all face, and especially people who are ambitious, who are driven, who really love what they do, figuring out how to do it in ways that allow them to be in love with it for years and years, rather than for a couple of years and then to hate it and have to leave. That's a really big personal challenge, and sort of it's one that we've all got to try to sort of figure out for ourselves.
Well, thank you for this, and I think the topic I want to take a moment to talk about is time, because I once worked with an event producer, and they took an American event to Europe. And she was freaked out because they were working on 15-hour days in America, and the European crew refused to do that. They said, we're doing 8 hours, and they looked at the whole scope and they said, we'll do it. And she's like, there's no way. It takes us 15 hours a day for our crew. And then she went over there. They produced the exact same show in 8 hours. The crew only had to work because the amount of time live. So obviously this would not work if it was a 15-hour show. It was not a 15-hour show. 15 hours was setting up and all of the rigmarole, right? Like all the behind the scenes. And then I can't remember the length of the actual show. Maybe let's say it was 4 hours or something. So this crew in Europe was able to do everything they needed to do behind the scenes in 4 hours and then still produce the same 4-hour show for the public. And she was freaked out, she told me, because they were like taking breaks and smoke breaks, and they were like all going out there, and she was like stressed out at the beginning, but they all got the work done. And I think it goes back to rest and some of the data that you found, because, and I find this in America, like my own research, not as diligent as yours, and that's why I respect your book so well. But you deplete yourself. I always use the metaphor of the drill. If you have a drill with one battery, because we have one battery, and you're drilling holes, and you have a certain number of holes that you had planned, and you get down to the last 10, and the battery's dying, do you sit there and go and hold it for hours, or do you plug it in and go home?
Right.
And then you come back in seconds, you drill those last 10 holes. So I guess in your research, or maybe start with, like, when did we start finding that time was the measurement? Because if you really think about it, if you go to a blacksmith back in the 1800s, it wasn't like, how much time did you spend hammering that shoe on my horse?
Right.
It was like, put the shoe on the horse. There was a result. At some point in the Industrial Revolution, time became the measurement of success in a way, which is crazy.
Now, so in the Industrial Revolution, there's labor historian E.P. Thompson talks about a shift from task-oriented work to time-oriented. Task-oriented was shoeing the horse, right? You've got a horse, it's got 4 hooves, sort of, maybe it's cooperative, maybe it's not. The work takes as long as it takes, and once you do that, you're done, right? Time-oriented work, in contrast, is you show up at the factory and you work for 8 hours.
Yes.
And then you leave. And so, and the factory owner tries to get as much labor out of you as possible. I think that the conundrum that a lot of us have sort of have fallen into is that for the last, century or so, time-oriented work has become, has dominated, but it's also dominated in areas in which it is increasingly useless as a genuine measure of or regulator of how we ought to work. Right. Arguably, on a factory line, this is something that you can you can kind of pull off, but for for creative work, for professional services, really for all work that isn't done by machines these days, almost. It is, time is useful for managers as a proxy for productivity or for other output or other good things, but it's not really that useful a one, right? It's convenient.
Because I guess it's easy. As an example, I was training a regional director once, which I don't really do that much anymore. I usually have to work with the leader because what I talk about and like what you talk about is so radical. If we don't have the top buying in, then they're not going to do it. But one time this regional director hired me directly. Mm-hmm. So his own cash out of pocket. Mm-hmm. And he's got coaching and he was running his thing and he was doing phenomenal. His management brought him in and they were yelling at him. They're like, your team, like it wasn't just him. He's like, you and your whole team, they're leaving earlier than everyone else. And, they're riding him. And he said, have you looked at my numbers? And they're like, they couldn't answer. And he's like opening his laptop and they're like, well, you better show us something because we're this close to firing you. They actually said those words out loud. He pulls up the numbers and they're in the boardroom when they're reprimanding him. He plugs his computer in, brings up the screen, and then his numbers were the best in the country. And he got promoted in that meeting. And they're like, okay, teach. And this is rare though, because this doesn't really happen. They said, teach what you're doing to all the other things because you're like far outperforming, but they were doing it in less hours. And this is where like you talk about KPIs, right? Key performance indicators. And then you have management looking at the hours. And then is that really creating the result that you want? And it's still happening. Right now, this is still happening.
Oh, absolutely. And, I think that for companies, the challenge is that, work doesn't end when the factory whistle, goes off or the sun goes down and we can all go in, come in from the fields. And and productivity in a lot of areas is really hard to genuinely measure once you're no longer like turning out X number of widgets per hour.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's why time becomes the proxy. But, I've been working with, companies that have moved to 4-day work weeks,
yes,
right? Without cutting hours, without cutting productivity or cutting people's pay.
Yeah, I knew what you meant. You're working less hours, but they're not cutting the pay.
Right.
Yes.
And, one of the things, I had a conversation with someone who was running a consultancy that was doing this and was getting some pushback from one client and said, we've been doing this for a while, and what we've realized is you got to ask yourself who's more professional, right? The firm that's able to do this work at this level in 4 days, or the firm that needs 6 days to do this.
Yeah.
And when you think about it that way, the question kind of is self-evident, right? That, but all too rarely do we ask that question either of ourselves or of our teams or our organizations or our professions. But once you do, it can provoke a moment of that can lead, you hope, to some positive change, like with your friend who got promoted rather than fired.
Yes. Well, and another one that just happened last year was working with a general contractor that's got like 50 years experience. He's like expert level. So this winery, and it's here in California in Sonoma, no names, but they had this construction project, and all of a sudden they made a massive error, and they hired a consultant for like a week. And like a whole week, and I don't remember the exact range. Let's say it was like 250 an hour, right? So then that's 10 grand, right? 40 hours, like a full week with a consultant, and they found a way to fix it for $300,000 to fix the air on this construction job. They said, oh man, and they knew something was off, and they knew my client, so they're like, let's have him come. He walked through the project in 30 minutes. He figured a way that they could fix it for like 15 grand.
Well.
Yeah, and then he called me because he's not a consultant. He said, "What do I charge?" And I said, "Well, think about that. That's the misnomer, right? Like this comes back to this whole thing. What if he's even 500? Let's say he's double the other consultant, and then what if he fractionalizes his time and he charges $250 for that 30 minutes because he only did 30 minutes? Then he just saved them." Over $200,000.
Right.
And so then is it okay that he is paid $250? Because it's not the time. He took 50 years to be able to do that. So, I mean, this is where it gets boggled in my mind, and how this is still happening. I think it's just, I'm going to ask this question with all your research, like, is it just complacency because it's just the way that we've been doing it for 100 years, so we're still doing it, and like people like you and me aren't loud enough yet that people are registering, like, wait a minute, this doesn't, because in this sense, like, literally the math doesn't make sense. You spend 10 grand on a consultant and they tell you it's 300,000, and then this guy that has all this wisdom can do it in 30 minutes. Should we pay them both 10 grand?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, what do you do?
I think that we have trouble estimating how much our time, or really our skill and our expertise, are genuinely worth, right? And this has a couple sources. Dan Ariely has a story about getting locked out of his house, calling a locksmith, explaining, I need to get in really quickly. The guy got the door open, without damaging the lock in about 5 seconds. And they were chatting after, and the locksmith said, usually if I open a lock that quickly, people get mad at me, right? They want to see you fiddle, try a couple things and take 20 minutes. Right. They need to see you working versus seeing you look at this thing, and because I've been doing this for decades, know exactly how to get in there.
Yeah.
And people have an easier time estimating the value of something based on time rather than on skill. And partly that's a function of maybe not understanding how skilled the other person is. I think also that, increasingly we're when we are doing things for others in which the value may be something that gets harvested, over years rather than immediately, or comes through various indirect, means. The money that you're not spending fixing a problem, for example.
Right.
Or with 4-day week companies, the increase in the quality of life from having a 3-day weekend every week for the rest of your life. Putting a dollar figure on that is pretty tough. Yeah. I'm probably undercharging for that. Yeah. But I think that that learning, we could all do a better job individually of making the case for our value, and being comfortable doing that.
Because there's a guilt.
I
want to add that.
Precisely.
I'm sorry to jump in on it, but
no.
I notice a lot of my clients when they learn this. I actually just interviewed a woman right before you, and then she was able to get her work week down to 20, and then you start feeling like, am I still giving enough value to the clients? But then through the conversation, she's like, actually, they're getting more value because I'm rested. They're getting a better service.
Yes.
But she felt guilty.
Mm-hmm.
Like that I didn't work enough hours to deserve this pay. So it's on both sides, right? Yeah. Like, anyway, I interrupted you, but it's like so deep in our way of modern society. Mm-hmm. That the service provider feel guilty. The other person feels like, oh, you didn't work, and it took you 5 seconds. Why is it $200 to open the door?
Yeah. So no, but I think that the confidence issue is a challenging one. The estimation of the value that you are going to bring, or that the other person is going to be able to take from, from your service, your time, that's hard to do. But I think, I think that we do tend to undervalue and therefore undercharge for our own time, and underestimate, how how much value we would create for everybody if we do things like learn those daily practices that let us be more effective in the time that we do spend with, with clients or creating things.
Well, and, what that triggers in me to keep this conversation flowing is sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
So think about, so once I had an acupuncture and I needed healing, and at the end, she said, "I'm sorry, but this is how much it costs." And I was like, what do you mean, sorry? And she's like, "Well, I feel bad taking money from my customers." I was like, "What?" I said, I have this belief already, though, like at you and I was like, I want to pay you. If I don't pay you, do you think you're going to be here? If none of your patients pay you, would you be here when I need my next session? And she's like, "Oh, yeah, you're right." I mean, it's to that level of not valuing, but then think about the sustainability. So in your book, you talk about, and I forget the name of the study, but they did like 20 years and they ended up going like 30 years after the initial person passed away. But they took, and you jump in if I say it wrong, but I'll just I'll tee you off. And how I remember, and this is a really exciting study that was in your book, one of my favorite there's so much in the book. 2 hours won't even be enough to talk about your whole book. People should just go read it. But and again, the book's rest. I know I'm like super plugging it, but I love it so much. It goes in line with More Business, More Life. So I'm not doing that. I'm doing that for me and Alex because we believe in this and we want this change in the world. So back to the study, they took 40 scientists, like MIT top of class, and then the ones that didn't do what we're talking about, they didn't take time for themselves. In the nutshell, and then let's extrapolate it, they actually declined.
Yeah.
So the sustainability wasn't there. And we talk about sustainability in our society a lot. And so if we actually go back to the time, if we marry these, sustainability and time, if we measure by time and that we put more time in and we work harder, we actually lose sustainability and then we lose our longevity. And so maybe this will help people get in their mind the value, because let's say as an example to tee you off, if I have to charge double so I can work 4 hours instead of 8 hours, but I do a better job and my service has less mistakes and, all these things, then does it warrant that additional value, right? I know that was a big thing, but that study is important because it tracked that it didn't work if they just worked more hours.
No, I think I think that being more confident in the value that we deliver is a great thing when we can do it. It's, it can be hard. It is, it's one of the harder things that I've had to learn how to do, and I'm still working on it. But I think that if you can make the case that, that I can do a much better job at this stage in my career than when I was just starting out.
Yes.
I have more skill, more empathy, experience, etc., and that, and therefore, this rate is one that makes sense. And if I'm thinking about my own life and work, if it's the case that working more deliberately, resting more deliberately, if those things then enhance the work that I'm able to do and the value that I'm able to deliver, and makes it possible for me to do that for longer, more of my life, those are all absolutely good things. And I think that the study you were mentioning does a really nice job of illustrating how valuable these practices can be over the course of your life. And that was a study of 40 scientists who got jobs in Southern California in the 1950s. And originally, what they wanted to understand was the psychology of genius, right?
Yes.
What were the particular personality qualities or such that made for for genius. And what they found was that there weren't specific personality things that explained why you had 4 Nobel Prize winners and National Academy of Science people and deans and so forth in this one camp over 20 years later. And then in this other cohort, you had people who were really struggling professionally. And what it turned out, though, was that first group there were a couple, number one, they had more serious hobbies and exercise, right? One of them, who won a Nobel Prize in chemistry, was a really serious surfer. Yeah. And the others were, they played tennis, they hiked, they, went skiing. They did all the kinds of things you can do in Southern California.
Climbing was one of them.
Yeah, climbing's very popular. And and they talked about this as being both a great break from their work, right? A great respite, but also sort of giving them a degree of kind of confidence and perspective that allowed them to be bolder when they were in the laboratory, right? When you are on when you're like a 20-foot wave and you've got thousands of tons of water bearing down on you, you really got to stay focused.
Yeah.
And if you can do that, then, then figuring out a particularly tricky bit in an experiment feels a little more doable. For the second group, though, what they found was that, they didn't exercise very much. They didn't have hobbies. They spent more time working, but they felt like they had less time, right? That they themselves felt less productive. And that first group, in addition to getting all the benefits of sort of exercise and sort of the better mind-body connection, they were also much more ruthless about prioritizing their own time, right? So, that the tide's going to be this time, so I've got to focus and finish up grading the papers and get through, do this work so that I have the time to get out on the water. And as a consequence, the group that was more accomplished, that was doing more, they reported feeling like they had more free time than the group that was working really hard. And I think it is one of the most beautiful illustrations of how over the course of, an entire career, making time for that sort of, apparently unproductive activity can be one of the best investments you make in yourself and in your work. It's incredibly productive.
And the study, and you can read all in there. It was remarkable. We're talking about, there was I think at least 3 Nobel Prize wins, like so many things. And on the other side, you had people that their careers just petered off. Some even became alcoholics. They started at the same. They're all top of class.
Exactly.
At the same level. So basically one accelerated their genius and one lost their genius, you could say, in that being this, or maybe not lost it, but it waned. It just went away. It goes back to the power drill. Like, you only have so much power if you don't recharge it, right? And you're spending 17 hours in the lab, and you might think this is where we sell ourselves. I'm giving everything to the project. I'm giving my whole life to this. And you are, like, literally, but you're also depleting all of your precious assets. Because some of my psychology teachers taught me the brain takes more energy than anything in the body. It takes the most blood, the most oxygen. I don't know if you ever heard the story that they took, someone did a study, and people can look this up, I forget the name of it. They took the top 2 chess players in the world and compared their caloric depletion to an NFL athlete in the Super Bowl with the most time on the field. And everyone picks the NFL, but it was the chess players that lose sitting there playing chess at a high level. Yeah. They actually were losing thousands of calories. They were the way they found it is they were getting skinnier. So again, it's this idea of recovering the mind, this idea of advancing it and playing. And I think, you hit on something that I always say. I tell people plan their fun first, because if you plan that fun, then it requires you to stop working. Then you end up getting more done. And the reason I had the revelation of this, I believe it was Zig Ziglar. Have you ever heard of him? He's an
Sure.
old sales teacher back in the day. He's passed on now, but he had this Acapulco story, and he said, "Hey, I have 2 tickets to Acapulco, and I had friends going. They're not going, and in the audience, hypothetically, if I were to give it away, who would want to go?" Everyone raises their hand, and he's like, "Okay, but we're leaving tomorrow at 8 a.m. Who still can go?" And some hands are still there. And then he went in the audience. He's like, "What do you have to get done by 8 in the morning?" And the person said, "I have to find someone to watch my dogs, find someone to watch my kids, find all these things." And he's saying, "You're going to get all that done before 8 a.m. She said, "Absolutely." And then he goes back on stage and he's like, "Why is that possible?" Right? And how much? And then he said, "Who gets more done before you go on vacation?" And everyone raises their hand. And it's like, why don't we do that every day? And so I think this goes, again, this is an echo. You just said it. When you know you're going to go surfing, you know, I have to get this done in 4 hours. So you have to. So then there's no way around it. I think that if we allow ourselves to have 8 hours, we're going to take 8 hours. If we allow ourselves to have 10 hours, you're going to take 10 hours. Why? And this goes back to the event that they did in 8 hours in Europe and they did it in 15 hours here. It was a choice in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that one of the things that I see really consistently in the daily lives of the people I write about rest, and more recently in the teams and companies I've worked with who've moved to 4-day weeks, is that it is difficult to underestimate how much like deep focus time supercharges your productivity. Yeah. Right? The amount that you can get done in 2 really concentrated hours versus 8 semi-distracted ones is enormous, right? And the way that people operationalize this is, number one, that when you look at, let's say, Einstein or Darwin or Stephen King or folks, they tended to work maybe 4 or 5 hours a day. That turns out to be all you need to write The Shining or The Origin of Species or the Fifth Symphony. But those 4 or 5 hours have to be really, really intense, right? And as you work, as you develop, you don't try and stretch out the number of hours that you work. You make the peak higher so that you can focus even deeper, number one. Right. The second thing is you break that up into periods of, let's say, 90 minutes to 2 hours, and you have breaks in between. So you can recharge the batteries, or go for a walk, just look out into the middle distance rather than at the keyboard. And so at the same time, the other important thing that layering these periods of deep work and deep rest does is give your creative subconscious time to work on a problem that maybe you haven't quite solved, but you're close to. And while you are apparently doing this unproductive thing, like in the back of your mind, still working through that still turning over that problem, and maybe will come up with another approach or a solution that you wouldn't have arrived at if you were just grinding away. And so that kind of schedule ends up actually delivering 2 benefits: that creative insight time and also that recovery time.
Right.
And then for groups, there's also the value of kind of coordination, right? It's the companies that will often redesign their work days and give everyone the same, like 2 or a couple hours of concentration time. And what they say is that, number one, we get a lot more done that way. Number 2, we're not interrupting each other because everyone's focused at the same time. And so there's like no reason to interrupt another person because you're all focused in this cooperative way. And then third, it's a little bit like going to the library during finals, right? You're in this environment where everyone's working really hard and you're all working on different things, but the fact that you're all together in this space, in this place, doing it at the same time makes everybody focus just a little bit more. And that, and all of those things together make it possible, that coordination, the deep work, the layering of work and rest, make it possible to, build a stage in 8 hours rather than 15, or to, for teams to complete difficult tasks in a day rather than a week, or for us, for us as individuals to write a couple really good pages in, sort of a really focused morning rather than struggling over the course of a long day to complete a mediocre paragraph.
Yeah, to force it. I mean, there's so much layers again in what you said, and your whole book has so many layers because the memory recall, like what you talk about in the book, the rest, how our brain starts to recover and more than recover, like actively reconcile all of our activities and putting it into our database in a way and merging things. And I think when I talk to a lot of human beings, they can say, yeah, I mean, I think many can relate to this one thing, that you're trying to solve a problem, whatever it is, whether it's mechanical, if it's thought, whatever it is, and you can't do it, and you're driving yourself nuts, and maybe you're staying up late, you finally break down and go to bed, and you wake up with the answer. Like, I've met many people that can relate to that.
Yeah.
And this goes back to that thing, letting it go into the subconscious. And so that active rest, or deep rest, as you call it in the book, is you're forcing your mind, like to go surf, to go climb, to even just sleep. That's a whole nother topic we could talk into too, napping and sleeping, but the amount of results. So I don't think that this is like some airy-fairy thought. I mean, that's why I love your book so much. I mean, the data is clear that when you work less and you work intensely in those units, like you're saying, that the results are undeniable. Like, I mean, you look at these studies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that we have seen this across all kinds of professions, right? It's not just novelists or mathematicians, right? You can see these same kinds of effects in nurses and doctors, or sort of in law enforcement, or factory work.
Yeah.
Just about every profession, you find that overwork turns out to be something that provides benefit for a very brief burst, right? It's sort of like a sprint, but it's not sustainable, and it ultimately ends up making your performance worse than it would be had you worked in a more measured kind of way. That's true for individuals. It's also true, it turns out, for sort of organizations. And I think that it is hard for us growing up with this kind of romantic idea of, creation as an act of self-sacrifice, right? We have so many stories of musicians or artists who seem to sacrifice themselves to make that one great piece of work.
Right.
And we think that's, when we're younger, that's really kind of romantic and cool,
Yeah.
right? Sort of Jimi Hendrix sort of dying at 27,
Right.
having done this unbelievable body of work.
Right.
And we also have this idea that success is something that can come through doing titanically long hours, right? Sort of 90-hour week, sleeping under your desk, and you become a billionaire.
Yeah.
And these are, it turns out, terrible, terrible models, right? I mean, and that it turns out we can do tremendous work and do tremendous, I think, good in the world if we back away from this idea of the romantic idea of work being something that ought to consume us rather than it being something that ought to sustain us.
Yeah.
And if you can make that switch, as the people in rest manage to do, then the results can be phenomenal. It's not something that's easy, right? I think that I take some comfort from the fact that even Nobel Prize winners have to learn this the hard way,
Yeah.
right? They get into their 30s, they have been accustomed to sort of being able to pull all-nighters and to survive on, basically like just raw energy.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, that stops working.
Yeah.
And they discover, that they can, change how they work and continue to do really great work or something even better.
Yeah, so no age, like you don't have to start this at a young age. If you're listening to this right now and you're in your 50s, you could make that change now.
Exactly.
Is what you're saying. Yeah.
No, I mean, the good news is that it's never too late to start.
Yeah.
No matter what.
I think in the book you said there was a woman that started at 75.
Yeah.
I forget who that was in there, but she ended up having a big part of her career until her 90s.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and the idea of retirement in itself, I've seen so many people, even in my own family, you do that and then they die. Like some of my family literally died because there's nothing more to live for. So when we think about why are we doing whatever we're doing, and as passionate people, if you're passionate about what you're doing, why would you ever want to retire? And so like the model that you're suggesting and that I also suggest is that working fewer hours for a longer period of your life, you get more enjoyment, more fulfillment. You also get more leisure time so you can enjoy your family, other things that you would like. It seems like win, 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 win. I think, this goes back to the early part of the conversation. We're trying to reprogram our minds, because I think it is this comes down to mindset and systemic patterning, I would even say, because that badges of honor, like you were saying, it's like, oh, my dad did it, my grandpa did it, or my neighbor did it, or everyone in my school did it. We're all putting the hours in, and we lose this life. I think where I want to go to next, and then I'm totally open whatever else you feel needs to be said, but it'll be good to get into some other data points around some of your chapters.
Sure.
But before I do that, I want to segue for a second, because we got deeper than I thought right away, which I love, by the way. But I'm really curious. I want to do a sidestep personally for you. How this work? Like how did you come to this work? I mean, in your life, what made you choose to study rest, and how did you come in? Did you stumble into this, or did you intentionally say, I want to know more about that? I'm curious.
Kind of some of both, I suppose. I mean, in a way, the book is an answer to a question that one of my favorite college professors posed the very first day in my freshman year. And this is a course called Invention and Discovery in the Arts and Sciences. And it was about the psychology of creativity and what is it that makes, or of people like Picasso or Einstein, Thomas Mann, etc., or of who they are and what makes it possible for them to do the work that they do. And, when you study this subject, you study how people work, which makes perfect sense, right? This is the thing that you're interested in.
Right.
And while that's sensible, it creates a bit of a blind spot, which is that it sort of leads you away from asking whether the way in which they rest, the hobbies they choose, sort of the timing of their breaks, do these things have any kind of impact on sort of, becoming Einstein? And that, and many, years later, I realized actually there was a story here to be told. And it was one that I discovered when I was having to work through these issues myself. Right? We're here in Silicon Valley, the world's capital of overwork. And I had been working as a technology forecaster and consultant for many years, and was really getting pretty burned out at it. It's really interesting work, but you're always doing it for demanding clients to uncertain standards. So you want to do a good job. And I always felt like I was sort of half a step behind where I needed to be, with no prospect of being able to catch up. And fortunately, had an opportunity to take a break to go to Cambridge and to the laboratory at Microsoft and do some work that eventually became a book that I did on technology and distraction. Halfway through that project, I had an epiphany, which was that I was getting amazing amounts of work done. I was reading cool stuff. I was writing, talking to interesting people, but I didn't feel any of the time pressure. That's just part of that's just in the air here in the Valley. And it's made me think maybe the assumption that we all sort of absorb, that in order to do good work, you've got to overwork. Yeah. That romantic idea that of great work requires great sacrifice.
Yes.
Maybe those things not only are wrong, maybe they're backwards. And it started me on the path of sort of looking at the daily lives of other creative people, getting into the neuroscience of creativity and the psychology of creativity. And all of that turned out to point to a story about sort of creative lives that were highly sustainable, that found ways of layering periods of work and rest on a daily basis, weekly, sort of over the course of seasons and years, and provided a bunch of sort of science that helped explain why it was that those practices or work, why they make sense, how they help us be more creative. And so ultimately the book was an effort to explain or to kind of create a roadmap for how I could continue to do work that sort of that I wanted to do, but in a more sustainable way and to a higher standard.
Yeah.
And so that's why I wrote the book.
Wow. Yeah. I always, many times it ties back to a personal story, because there's the desire, like for me, my father and my grandfather and my great grandfather, I didn't get to meet him, but they all were workaholics. Mm-hmm. And it's the immigrant story and maybe that's why this happens in America so much, because so many of us are immigrants, right? And so we came here for this new life, and the way to do it was we were taught, work hard and you'll change your life. And in some ways they did. I respect what they did. They did make a better life than my family came from Italy and Southern Italians. It was a tough life. And they came here and they did make a better life. So I'm grateful for that. But then I always had an itch like you. Like, I know I want to do great work, but I don't want to give up my life. And I want to know my kids. I had it. My father, physically I know him, but did I really know him? Did we have deep conversations? Those things weren't available because they're absent, because work became the main thing. And, so thank you for your curiosity extending into your writing, because I think it's a gift to the world. And this is what we seriously, like, I'm not blowing smoke here. This is real stuff that we can change. And I think in some ways, we need to look back to go forward, because there was wisdom from some of these stories. So some of the stories you tell are before the Industrial Revolution, and like the remarkable things. And then some are through that period. People that did live in the 1900s and did this, but they were rogue. Mm-hmm. They were looked at as like, whoa, those are the weird ones. But then they did amazing things, and it's undeniable. And I made like a little note card, so maybe I can hit on some big points. So we've hit the fewer hours. I mean, because in all these things, just to mind you, anyone listening, and you're like questioning any of this, then you might as well just read the book, because the data is real and it's undeniable. But, so we hit the fewer hours pretty hard. Maybe we'll come back to that. And then I think I kind of want to skip to walking, but we also had the morning routine. I think the morning routine made that intention so skillful. And maybe let's touch on morning routine for a second, because I find that you're the freshest, right? And so if we're going to work intensely, it makes sense to have that routine and make it habitual, so you get that done and then you play the rest. Then it's almost like you can do whatever you want the rest of the day, because you already got your genius then, right?
Exactly. No, sort of the time. The time you rest is the time that you earn. And sort of you make one of the best ways to make more space for sort of rest in your day is sort of to front load the work, sort of, and to start in sort of the super early morning. I discovered this when I was sort of writing a book called The Distraction Addiction. And I found I had two little kids, and it was impossible at the end of the day after they were in bed, to get any work done. I was just too tired. And so I tried flipping the day, getting up at like 5 a.m. And I found it was really hard for about the first 3 weeks. And then something clicked, and I discovered that it was still tough to get up, but it was really paying off. That being able to work for a couple hours when no one else is up, in that kind of, it's like the whole world is silent, offered an opportunity, a sort of space to think about things more deeply than I could in the rest of the day. I think in a sense also because I was often still a little tired. It was like the door to my creative subconscious was still a little bit ajar.
Right.
And so, sometimes I would be working on something and I would write a line and then I would look at it and think, where did that come from?
Like, wow.
Yeah. No. And, and the other thing I think about, that I discovered that helped make my morning routine sort of really work was you'd mentioned intentionality, and getting up early in the morning requires it's like crystallized intention, and so for me, I think a really good morning routine starts the night before. I set up absolutely everything I possibly can. Right, I write out the 2 or 3 things that I'm going to work on.
Yeah.
Right, I set up the coffee maker, the clothes I'm going to wear, etc. So that, and I even will use a writer's trick of stopping mid-sentence the day before, because that means that, you get up and you lift up the laptop and you're not confronted with the existential angst of the blank page.
Yeah.
Instead, you just finish the thought that you had yesterday, and then you keep going. And that turns out to be, I think, for me, an amazingly valuable set of practices that made it possible for me in the last 10 years to write, to put out 4 books, whereas in the 10 before then, when I was trying to work really hard to the sort of romantic ideal, I managed to produce 1. I think, morning routines are very, very personal. Like, my kids will get up early and go kayaking or paddleboarding and stuff. I've gone out once or twice with them, and I have come back and I felt great, and I've taken a nap and I woke up at dinner time. It's like a workout that early in the morning just puts me out for the whole rest of the day.
Yeah.
I know for some people it's incredibly energizing.
Right.
Twyla Tharp does it. She goes works out 5:30 every morning before before going to the studio and doing choreography. But I think that if you can build a routine, then it turns out that's an incredibly valuable thing for you.
Yeah, and it could be different for everyone, but I think it is beautiful. I find my morning is my genius time too. And I think I before we move to this next topic, I want to maybe start that window of magic space too, because I think I went to Thomas Edison's winter lab in Florida to show my kids when he was quite young, and he had that seat. You kind of bring it up in different ways, the where they drop the weight. Thomas Edison had a cup and a chair there. It was like a metal cup, and he had ball bearings, and he sat. So it was very similar to, I forget, it might have been
Salvador Dali who writes about it.
But that would have, the time period, that would have been before Edison, huh? Or
after Edison.
After. Okay, thank you. So it was a cup of stainless steel, and he would hold ball bearings and sit there, is what they told us on the tour. And then he would go in between that state, and he would just have a notepad there, and so he would, when he fell asleep, it would go ding 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 ding, and then he would wake up and then write, and you're kind of in that. And this is studied now too in meditation, right? Going from beta, theta, those brain waves. So like what you're saying, I just wanted to echo that for everyone listening, that's real stuff. There's there's other stuff, and you bring some of that up in the book. But there's even more studies on that, opening that portal. And you did bring up Gaudí as well in the book. And I was on a tour in Barcelona with my wife and kids, and I meditate every morning too, and it does open things up for me. And I was watching this, and they're showing at the turn of the century, because he was 1800s, and I can't remember, it was early 1900s when he died. Yeah. He was doing like ventilation systems that were unheard of, but crazy stuff. And I leaned over to my wife and I said, this guy had to be meditating. And right then the tour guide turned and said, and he was very religious, he would go to church and pray for an hour 3 times a day. So it's like what you were talking about with the routine. He would go do his genius, then he would go back to church and pray, quote unquote. And maybe I'm sure he was, like whatever, he was devoting his time, but he was pausing and having like a form of a meditation. Right. So again, I guess I'm telling all these stories to echo what you're saying, because these are real data points, and I'm hoping that this conversation will open up more minds to other ways to do things as you and I find it. So I'm going to switch to another one, walking. It's huge in the book, and it's huge in my life. I found it really amazing, the things that you found. So were you already like a walker before this, or like through this data, did that open up like for you as well?
The things that that convinced me of the value of walking were partly the data, partly getting a dog.
Okay.
And I found that, especially when I was writing, write from 5 to 7, take the dog out for about an hour or so.
Okay.
And I would always have something that I've been working on whether it's a transition or how to craft a particular argument that, I hadn't finished. And when I was out with the dog, that stuff would be kind of running around in the back of my mind. And all of a sudden I'd come up with the answer. And I carry around sort of a notebook with me now, because I found that if I don't write it down immediately, I'm likely to forget it, no matter how good an idea it is, because my mind doesn't seem to want to spend time remembering the stuff. It wants to move on to the next problem.
The next challenge.
Right? So, as far as it's concerned, having had that moment, like, it's done. So it's like on my conscious self to figure out how to sort of record. So, go out for the walk, and would regularly have these little aha moments that made the next piece of the writing a little bit easier, go a little more smoothly. And for me, it was a confirmation of the research that we've seen that tells us that walking, boosts your sort of score on creativity tests. It has benefits for sort of your well-being. Of course, it also has benefits for your physical health, your circulation, which is important for, or delivering energy to your brain, which is perpetually greedy, as we'd said. And that, for all of these reasons, that, walking has become of, a really important part of, of my sort of daily practice as a writer, and it is for so many people.
Yes, it's like all across all industries, as we've said in other parts of this conversation. So even the one pinpoint in the study, and I know you did a number of studies in the book around this, but one of them, they did those tests where they were doing cognitive and creative tests, where you just went outside and sat, and then sat indoors, and then you walk outdoors, and then you walk on a treadmill with no windows, and then they even push people around in a wheelchair.
Right.
But all of that, whether they were outdoors or indoors, the walking prevailed, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, there was before that study, there was a theory that, maybe it's being outdoors that provides a creative stimulus. And it definitely does provide a boost. No question about that. And we've seen, there's actually another study that's been done in Edinburgh, walking in a park versus an industrial section. And walking in the park, turns out, sort of does increase your creativity a little more than sort of walking past, sort of like tilt-ups. But the great thing about sort of that study that looked across all those different conditions was it really did serve, I think, to nail down that the physical act of walking turns out to provide sort of creative stimulus.
Yeah.
We don't really understand why that is, but it is definitely a measurable effect.
Right. And that's the first place to start. We might not have, the last 5 to 10 years, the brain scans and all that, how much more we know about our brain, and then how much we don't know yet.
Yeah.
So it's okay we don't know, but the data and the study after study is like, it becomes undeniable. So even if we don't know exactly how it works, we know that it does provide. And I think, so it's that movement. And so those are the things when you're taking those breaks that we're talking about, adding that in, you're going to go solve those problems. So maybe you go get a dog if you don't have one, right?
Right.
Yeah. Let's switch I want to talk a little bit about sleep, but let's start with naps, because I think, man, in other parts of the world, people still do nap, but I think overall, as I've traveled around the world, I think a dying habit. And it goes back, I think maybe it goes to the badges of honor and everything, that I can work and I don't need sleep and all those things. But, that's also undeniable evidence. Some of these geniuses would take naps, right? I mean, the data is there. Maybe speak to that, like how important is it? Because I think this is the one where it's like no one, like so very few people that we probably, I don't know if you found this, but very few people I meet take naps.
Yeah, sort of naps are vastly underrated, and sort of I think get a, they now have a bad reputation, right? We see them as, something that 4-year-olds do on those little, yoga mats.
The blue mat.
Yeah, and if you are, you're a serious worker or you're just a grown up, you ought to be able to just power through. And, this is why we have coffee. But it turns out that, first of all, that when you compare the efficacy of coffee and, or of even a brief nap in the afternoon, naps win, right? That they provide a better sort of recharge of your physical batteries, but it also provides a better mental break and sort of mental recharge as measured in attention and sort of other kinds of cognitive tests. But it's also the case that, there were a few people like Thomas Edison or Salvador Dali who napped in particular ways that they thought would help them be like unlock creative insights.
Right.
The thing that drove Edison and Dali was the idea that as you're falling asleep, it's like you're partly conscious, you're partly unconscious.
Right.
And it's in those moments when you can have these really striking ideas or images. Dali talks about how when you start work on a painting, your subconscious has already completed it. And it's just a matter of retrieving those
like
things
the
from your
file,
mind.
like take
Exactly.
the file out of the drawer.
Right. And so part of the point of having sort of the practice of napping with ball bearings was that you would start, you would get drifty, you might have these ideas, but if you fell asleep, you'd forget them, right?
Right.
But if you woke up at exactly the right time, the ball bearing hits, makes a noise, then you'll still have that idea and you'll be able to write it down. Even if you don't do that, though, naps turn out not only to provide sort of that bit of sort of later creative boost and sort of restoration of sort of your mental and physical faculties, but naps are also associated in the long run with things like lower rates of dementia or chronic disease. Just like sleeping during the night, or naps turn out to provide long-term health benefits that as you get older, you're really, really going to appreciate. So that's why you should do them.
That's so beautiful. Well, on that, what would you say out of all your research, what's your favorite nap story out of all the people that you did? I don't know if it's someone famous or it's not someone famous, but what was your favorite nap story?
My favorite nap story, the Salvador Dali one has always really been interesting to me because, for one thing, Dali was phenomenally creative in sometimes some very strange ways. He also talks about it in a book called 50 Secrets of Artistic Craftsmanship, something like this.
Okay.
And some of the advice he gives is absolutely bonkers. Right? They're like recipes for making things with octopus eyes and stuff that will charge up your energy. But the thing about naps is incredibly detailed and specific and actionable. And it makes me think that like the other 49 things are just pieces of bizarre performance art. But he actually really did the thing with the naps, right?
Okay.
You can imagine him doing that much more easily than you can imagine him consuming a squid ink aperitif, every afternoon.
Yeah.
So I think that one's my favorite.
Okay. And there's more in the book, so it's So good. I think you were alluding to the stop, your chapter on stop. That's kind of like stopping in the middle of the line, like you said. And I found that too. When I wrote my first book, I was staring and I wasn't making it happen. I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't do it. And then because I'm a speaker, one of my friends suggested that I record. So I actually transcribed some of my spoken word and then I edited, and I thought that I was going to delete. I thought I was going to like trim it up, but it actually expanded my mind, and I wrote, and more stories came out of my mind. So I think I had a place to start, but here we're talking about stopping because you're leaving it where you're with like a thread, so your brain has like a tether to go on,
Right. Yeah, and that the kind of disciplined, practiced version of that is, let's say you give yourself 500 words, that you've got to write today, and you stop at 500. Doesn't matter where you are, and the benefit of that is that, first of all, the next day, when you go back, it's more like a little bit of a writing exercise than having to absolutely be fresh, right? It's a little bit of a warm up. The second thing is that there is some evidence that when you have this thing unfinished, your creative mind will keep working on it even while you're doing other things, and won't just think about the end of the sentence. We'll think about the next paragraph or the next section or chapter. There's another version of stopping, which is recognizing that you're out of power and putting the tool down. Yeah. And leaving the work for another time. And I was reading something that an interview with Neil Young, and he was talking about, my favorite Neil Young song is one called Powderfinger, which is on Rust Never Sleeps, and it's this. The lyrics are fantastic and haunting, and it's a wonderful song. He recorded this in '79. That's when the album came out. He started work on that song in 1967 and got stuck. And he said, and I thought I had something there, but I just couldn't quite figure it out. So I put it down because I knew I wasn't going to make more progress on it if I just forced it.
Right.
That eventually something would happen and I'd be able to finish the song. And in 72 or so, he gets it about 90% of the way and then puts it down again, and then a couple years later finishes it.
Wow.
And, for one thing, I want to know, where do you keep an incomplete song, right? Does he have a big notebook, or is it a filing cabinet or something? But it's a great illustration, one of many from the history of music, that, sometimes the best thing you can do when you're stuck is to stop and to trust that you're good enough, or there's some part of you that's creative enough to take this up and to finish it. Yeah. That it's not just about continuing to grind away at it, and that if you do that, then you'll have, eventually you'll finish the song. Yeah. So that's that's the other piece of wisdom about stopping.
It's so good. I'm wearing this turtle pendant, and I wear it because again, I was born in Silicon Valley, and the rabbit, or whatever you want to call it, the continual racing. I've had to, and I wear this to remind myself to slow down, because even still to this day, I can have this reaction mode to just drive, and I need to slow down. And I was with a client once, and she was another in tech and 100 miles an hour woman, made it really high in Fortune 500 companies. And I remember coaching her once, and she's like, I already slowed down. I'm at 50, and that's really slow for her because she's 100 miles an hour. And I said, pull over. Pull over. You need to stop. And, because again, it's in a way almost, I want to say the word disease, which is disharmony, right? We're not pausing. And then then you force through, and then how long does that take? You could force 2 years of a project, but if you were willing to give yourself pause, you can make a great song, you can make a great thing. It's so important, and that comes back to the, the napping and the sleep. These are things that are underrated. I know growing up in Silicon Valley, and when I started my career in my first companies, I used to say sleep is for dead people.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Right.
and I was so proud of that.
Yeah.
It's but in fact, it's ridiculous. And like, I know looking back now, I was not as nice of a person. I had a shorter temper. Like, I couldn't put up with other people if they couldn't keep up, And I look at it now and I'm like, wow, I was a jerk. And I wasn't like I was consciously being that. I didn't have any patience because I had nothing left. I was depleting my energy and never letting myself fully recover.
Mm-hmm.
So in that, like, with all of your research, what would be, again, if we pick one story on this, because I want to go over a few more points before we finish our talk today, but what would be like, the best story that maybe has a contrast of
Mm-hmm.
that, like not sleeping and sleeping, where you can see that sleeping wins.
Right. My favorite example is World War II,
Okay.
or of Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill.
Okay.
So if you go to the Imperial War Museum and the sort of under the Treasury Building, which is where the Cabinet War Room, or
Yeah,
you
and this is
see-
in the UK.
This is in
Yep,
this
yep.
is in London. Sort of you see like the radio room where Churchill would talk to Roosevelt, and the meeting room with the maps and like the strategy spaces and stuff.
Okay.
And then there's a little bedroom where every day after lunch, Winston Churchill would get undressed, put on pajamas, and take a 2-hour nap. And everybody had to be quiet because, like, if the typists were going or stuff, you'd wake up and he'd be irritable. And he maintained this through the Blitz, through the darkest days of the war. And in a weird way, it was inspirational to his people, right? Winston believes enough, even when things are bad, that we're going to prevail, that he's going to take a nap. Hitler, on the other hand, as is documented in a magnificent book called Blitzed by
Okay.
Norman Ohler, had this crazy doctor who came up with various concoctions of like hormones and cocaine and stuff that would supposedly allow Hitler to stay awake for weeks on end. And he, and particularly toward the end of the war, he really relied on this stuff to, work 48 hours at a stretch and I think in that case, the results really speak for themselves, don't they?
This is mine.
Yeah, that the guy who was doing the 2-hour naps turned out to have a much better outcome at the end of the war, than the guy who was, burning the candle at every possible end. So that's my favorite contrast.
Well, yeah, and again, so many more stories. But that is a huge contrast, and then with the evidence of the outcome. And thanks for going all over the place with me on this, but they're always on one theme, right? That how do we work in a better way? How do we do our good work and live a good, meaningful life and have more sustainability? And one of that is recovery. But I think when we use that word, many people think of like sitting on the couch and watching Netflix. So can you like broaden that into like the definition that you would call recovery?
Yeah. We often think of rest or recovery as an entirely passive thing, right? It's, on the couch with the remote in one hand and like a bag of salty snacks in the other. And one of the really interesting things I discovered when I was writing the book was that the most restorative kinds of rest are often active rather than passive. That, people, like, it's not just like irritatingly energetic people who say that they feel more charged up, after working out at the gym than before. That's actually a real thing, and that if you want to have a good life, often the most restorative kinds of rest that you can choose are is rest that is physically or cognitively active and challenging, rather than rest that is primarily passive. One of the corollaries of that as well is that rest is actually kind of a skill. It's something that you can get better at, right? It's a little bit in a way like breathing. Breathing is something that's totally natural. We all do it. But when you're learning to meditate, or let's say you're learning to sing, one of the things that you're taught is how to use your breath.
Yes.
To calm yourself, to project to the back of an auditorium, or as an athlete to get a little charge of energy, sort of at the sort of at the end of a race. And rest is very much like that. It's something that we all know how to do, but it's something that we can all learn how to do better. And I think that, particularly for people who are, who like a challenge, sort of recognizing that rest is something that you can get better at, turns it into, sort of something that maybe they're a little bit more likely sort of to want to master, along with all of the other things that they've mastered in their lives.
It's exciting to think that you can get better at it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think part of it is conscious. It's about sort of playing around with daily routines, with morning, or of morning practices, etc. Part of it, though, is also just your body and your sort of subconscious sort of learning to anticipate it and doing whatever they do in order to use it more successfully. I think it's a little bit like learning language, right? There's the formal element of understanding grammar or remembering vocabulary, but there is also something that goes on in our minds that turns us from people who struggle with a language to people who are fluent at it.
Right.
And whatever it is that accounts for fluency kind of happens, sort of happens within us. It's not something that we can control, but it's definitely something that ultimately we can do. And I think learning to rest more skillfully and getting more out of it is exactly the same.
And I can feel all this. So for those that are listening and or watching this right now, what would be an example of improving your rest? If you could give, if there's one that really hits the top of your list, what's an example of improving your rest?
I think that sort of working, if you have a kind of schedule where you can work breaks in,
yes,
then I think that is terrific. If I had to nominate a single thing that is sort of worth doing, it is, first of all, better sleep, right?
Okay.
I think that taking sleep seriously is one of the best things you can possibly do for yourself and for your future self. And then the second thing is walks. I think, walking, of all the kinds of exercise, it's one that we're able to do, we do every day. You don't need special equipment for it.
Right.
And the payoff in terms of sort of improvements in cardiovascular health, et cetera, are sort of undeniable and outsized. So so work regular breaks into your daily routine if you can. Definitely sleep better, sleep more, and sort of go, and regularly, maybe as part of point one, go on walks.
That's beautiful. And, I think I told you, and many of the people that watch our show or listen to it, they know that I was paralyzed. And so coming out of that, I used to trail run, and then that just wasn't possible. And so once I could move, walking is such a beautiful thing. And now it's when I don't. And recently, as I told you, I hurt my knee, and so I couldn't walk. And part of me is missing. I'm so used to it because now for years I've been walking every single day. Once I could walk again, and when you lose that thing, like losing to walk, when I got it back, I was like, oh, and so then I wanted to do it every day. And so I'm average at least 2 miles minimum every day. And I guess I want to interpolate it to something that makes you feel good, like waking up and brushing your teeth, or when you're hungry, you eat. So now it's such a fabric of my life that if I don't go on a walk, it's like I missed a meal or something. Mm-hmm. It's that much inside of me. So I can solely relate. For me, that's how I can relate to that. That is really big. Let's I think I have like two main ones, and if there's anything else you want to add, like the deep play, like not just dabbling, right? Like, and that's why I like the analogy of like climbing or like you said, surfing, because sometimes your life is at risk. So it makes you focus. But, we're talking from things from like, being deep in music, climbing, surfing. I mean, you name it, these things. And you're in the book, you showed like data that it even went beyond, even further than like, maybe just taking a small break. The folks that actually rest in a deep way, and a bit, like you said, active is another word. Maybe out of all those stories, like what's, again, I know I'm picking, why I like the stories. I mean, we can talk about the data, but people remember the stories. And that's why I think,
Very true.
Your book has both. It has the data and the story. So maybe just, I guess, hit on both then. Like, what, with the deep play, what did you find? And then maybe what's your highlight story?
Right. The thing with deep play started with kind of a paradox, which was that I was saying that there were a lot of these people who were incredibly ambitious. They're, sometimes they're in like races to make some big scientific discovery, and they're taking a month off and they're going skiing or they're doing something, and I thought, what in the world, sort of how counterproductive is this? But what I realized is that so many of these folks had really serious hobbies that did a couple things, right? And this can be mountain climbing, can be playing chess, sort of people who are serious musicians or amateur painters. And what they got from it was, first of all, these were things that were, these were areas in which they could excel, at least to some degree, sort of that, and sort of being good at something and exercising that actually delivers a degree of pleasure and satisfaction that sort of we shouldn't underestimate.
Right.
But, but having sort of serious hobbies that give you some of what you love about work when it goes best in a different medium and at a different time scale, usually a much shorter time scale, was something that I kept seeing again and again in people's discussions of why they love to paint or climb or surf. So Henry Kendall, who won a Nobel Prize in physics for his experimental work establishing the existence of quarks, was a serious, really serious mountain climber. He was also a photographer. He was one of the first people to carry, in his case, a Leica M3, which was one of the first really great and really portable cameras with him when he went climbing. And he has incredible pictures from the 50s of his friends, on El Cap and in Yosemite. And he talked about how climbing was like doing physics, right? That you have, it's this incredible engagement with nature. You have this incredibly big problem that you have to break down into a lot of separate steps. There's a highly technical aspect to it. But it was different from physics in that, at the end of the day, either you were at the top of the mountain or you weren't. So often when you do experiments, you can work on them for a year and the data will say, yeah, maybe, right? Not yes, not yet, not no, or unclear.
Right.
And there's nothing less nothing less satisfying and more frustrating to a scientist than an outcome like that. But an awful lot of science turns out to be like that. It was also, though, very different in that it's intensely physical. And when you're on the mountain, you've got to be 100% focused on that, right? You can't
because you could die.
Yeah. You can't be thinking about that grant proposal or, am I going to get tenure? Because if you start thinking about that stuff, you're going to make a mistake and you're going to die. And that really put, for Kendall, it sort of put his ambition in perspective, right? He always wanted to be a great, to do great science, but it reminded him, and climbing gave him some of those satisfactions, but they also, in a way, tempered that ambition or put it in perspective, right? That there were other things in life, man. And sort of keep, and just keep in mind sort of when you have that next professional setback, you do things where the stakes are a lot higher and could be a lot worse. And I think that part of the value of sort of this kind of deep play is that it helps remind you of what you love best about work when it goes well, but it can also provide a degree of perspective that when it doesn't go well, maybe it's not as huge, as devastating a thing as it would otherwise feel if you didn't have this this other realm in which you really did play at life or death stakes.
Life or death. So it has that contrast in a big way that you wouldn't have noticed. It's really amazing in that, and it brings so much light to what we should do with our life and how many different things we could try. I mean, one thing that popped in my head as you're sharing this is, our goal of helping people live a better life, kind of brings back to like, what are the mountain climbing schools? Are they reading your book? Because then could they use this data to go into science labs and enroll new students in climbing? How can both sides play, right? Because here we're you and I go talk to all these businesses and they're like, oh, I could do that, or I could work more hours, right? And hopefully they're listening to us. Hopefully they're listening to this podcast. And then on the other side, maybe the people that play, like the music, or even where we're recording this right now at Sound Union in Redwood City, give them a little plug. They're creating space for musicians to come play and stop working, and in Silicon Valley where it's needed, right? Or really near it, they basically are bringing people in. So these things are just amazingly, and it's fascinating when you read the data. Oh my gosh, this works.
Yeah.
It works, and then so we should be doing this and live a better life, and everyone's happier. The clients that I've worked with, they're like, wow, it's like that word freedom starts popping in. You're like living that life. So speaking of freedom, kind of ties into this other one, and I think it's my last one of my notes here. Sabbaticals. Like that is it's almost like naps. It's like it's in the same realm, right? Completely. And I'll even put it to me. I'll kick this off. I took a 2-year sabbatical to heal, but I was paralyzed. Like I've been teaching this stuff before that, but even I didn't allow myself to have a sabbatical. So I think it is highly underrated. And like I gained more than I lost through this physical ailment that I went through because of that sabbatical, because of the thought, because of the growth in my mind, in my studies, being able to read more books, being able to think and extrapolate what I'm doing to the next level. And I'm like, boy, I wish I didn't have to be paralyzed to have this, and now choosing more sabbatical. So in my future, I'm already planning ahead. When can I take another one? I guess in line with how we've done this whole conversation, what did you find? What's like if there's some big notes, because, in this, I guess I'm going to say, even in this length of conversation we've had, we still are only scratching the surface on the amount of information that's out there. So what would you pick in the highlight of like how big sabbaticals are, and then maybe even again another highlight story that you have? Yeah.
So I think that sabbaticals, even short ones, can be life changing, right? I think my sabbatical at Microsoft really yielded in 3 months the ideas that sort of drove 3 books over the next 10 years, and that's not that unusual. The keys for having a sabbatical that really pay off are go somewhere else that's different but not incredibly alien, and to the degree that it's possible, don't bring your normal work with you.
Okay.
Right. So lots of people make the mistake of staying in touch with the office or their students or so on, and it's really easy to get sucked back into reacting to stuff that's happening back home. You want your sabbatical to be a space in which you can have really different thoughts, and you can pursue, whether it's the cultivation of skills or some project, you can pursue that really deeply.
Yes.
And that's hard to do if you're checking your work email.
Yeah.
Another, and then the going someplace else part is valuable because partly to reinforce that, sort of mental separation between sort of your regular life and your sabbatical life, but also as a source of sort of creative stimulus that can hold outsized benefits. It is going someplace that is novel, but not so different that you end up spending all of your mental bandwidth trying to like figure out the money and dealing with the local administration or something.
Right.
Can be really tremendous. So there was a study, for example, of engineers here in Silicon Valley and the kind of cultural distance that they travel and the relationship between that and their creativity. And they found that, sort of people who had spent time in other cultures, in other places, or who saw themselves as kind of having sort of multicultural backgrounds, they tended to be sort of more productive engineers as measured by either their bosses or a number of patents that they've gotten, GitHub commits, and so forth. There was also a study of fashion designers. And, in fact, in the world of high fashion, people are moving all the time, right? You're French, but you're working in Milan this year, and then next year it's Stockholm or Seoul, etc.
Okay.
And what they found was that, number one, that kind of travel, going abroad even for like 6 months, increased your creativity for the next couple years. And that there was a kind of sweet spot of going someplace different but not too different. And of course, what too different is can differ for sort of different
to your
folks.
taste again,
But
like how much you are. But I can see
Exactly.
there's some level of comfort that everything is not so new that you're completely dominated by that. Is my understanding of what you're saying.
Exactly. Right. So you want to be out of your comfort zone to some degree, but not so far out that you can't make sense of the world,
Right.
and you spend all your time just kind of trying to get through the day.
Yeah.
So if you can find those places, then that can, even if you're there just for a few weeks, it can generate ideas that can, make a difference for the next 10 years.
Like you said, 2 years, 10 years. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. What's your favorite, out of all your research, was there a sabbatical story that stands out?
I think that Bill Gates' Think Weeks, in their regularity, and their simplicity, right? He would take a week, he would go to this cabin with a bunch of articles and no internet, no email, and he would just read.
Yeah.
And that for him was of a chance to kind of reset, to dive deep into some, of ideas that he couldn't when he was, sort of being CEO. And for him, both let him recharge, but also gave him a sort of strategic perspective that turned out to be really important for Microsoft when he was running it. So I think, have your, if you can't do anything else, have your own Think Week. Have it every year. Go, sort of go someplace different, and the results, even for something that short, can be sort of mind-altering and life-changing.
That it just reminds you, like, just in small chunks, because even, I don't know if you ever read the book The Diamond Cutter.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever seen it? Yes. And he talks about that taking 1 day a week. And my other friend that wrote, oh man, I'm blanking on it, but it's The Game of Joy, because there's so many joy books. But he took 1 day a week off, and then he calculated how many more days of retirement he had. Because if you just take 1 day a week off, how much more? But this in the Diamond Cutter, he took 1 day a week as like a mini sabbatical, and then 2 weeks a year, and he solved all these problems in the diamond industry.
Wow.
just by doing that. So it's the same as it's just another story very similar to what you're talking about with Bill Gates, to take that time. And it doesn't have to be a year-long sabbatical. It can be a 2 weeks, but it's different than a vacation in the ways that you just described, that you're doing all those other elements and you're removing yourself from the regular pace of life, and that you're finding that time to devote to something else, right? I guess, to put it as a way. And the one thing that just to bring it to an entrepreneurial thing, since this is the More Business, More Life show, and just hearing if you have any comments on this, I've told people too when I'm training them, one thing I don't really like, there's a lot of people out there that coach people to build a business to sell, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things is to remove yourself from the business, because if you're in the business, if you're the craftsman, if you're the baker, it's really hard to sell, right? I actually help people build businesses to create residual income. So like, if you can remove yourself from the business and it can keep cash flowing and it can keep paying you a dividend, why would you ever sell that unless you're removing the money? But the reason I bring it up is that when I'm teaching those entrepreneurs, I tell them to leave for a week, but do not answer the phone. To your point, like, don't answer the phone, don't take any calls. And because it's also a test, because then next time do 2 weeks, then next time do a month, then next time do 3 months. And in that, because you remove yourself from it, each time you come back and see what broke.
Right.
And so a lot of times to their realization, nothing breaks.
Yeah.
It's like it's the fear that you can't let go.
Yeah. And I think for organizations, it's an opportunity to, have a succession plan, to give sort of your number two an opportunity to, see what actually running the place is really like, to get some experience, and to make it possible, for sort of the organization to function without you. Yeah. Which is a really valuable thing for everyone.
It's healthy. Even Giovanni, who's in the room here, and he's been on the podcast, so he has been my second hand my whole, for a long time, since we've been working together since 2015, and he carried my company while I was paralyzed. Mm-hmm. And even after, he's like, I did stuff I didn't even know I could do. Right? To your point, it's an opportunity to step up, which wouldn't have occurred. And it also happened in my family, because my son stepped up, my wife stepped up, my daughters, everyone stepped up. So sometimes when you're a really passionate person, we cast big shadows. And when you lay down, you give space for others. Yeah. Which is very, very healthy. That's so beautiful. I get, before I do my closing question, is there anything else? Because I tried to get a good range of your book, because I thoroughly enjoyed it, if I haven't said it enough times. But it just from all different walks of angles you covered, and validating how important this is. Is there anything that you think I missed? Is there any highlight that you think that people should know? If they heard all this conversation and there's anything that I missed and I didn't ask you, did I cover it good, or do you have something?
I think you did great. I think the new edition of the book has a chapter that I added about sort of deliberate rest and successful aging. And this is not a subject that I was particularly interested in a decade ago when I was starting to work on the book. Yeah. But of course, this has become something that I've been sort of much more interested in now. And it turns, and when you get into the gerontology literature and the literature on sort of what allows people to have, to be healthy, active, sort of into their 70s or 80s, it turns out that what gerontologists recommend are all of the things that the people I was talking about in the book are already practicing, right? Or the exercise, the naps, sleeping, the vacation. It turns out even taking regular vacations has a positive impact on your long-term physical health and your sort of risk of dementias later in life. And so, this is a set of, it's a set of practices. It's a way to live that not only, I think, makes for better work and a better perspective on work, but really will let you do it for many decades and increase the odds that your last years sort of are good ones, rather than a sort of a struggle or
Or,
you
and
know,
a
kind
speedy
of fog of
decline.
senescence.
Yeah,
Exactly.
or because
Right.
that's what you see too. You work so hard, and you think you're going to have those last years great, and then your body falls apart,
Yeah. Yeah.
or your mind.
Right. And sort of, you know, sort of gerontologists talk about sort of good aging as sort of, you know, sort of basically a sudden decline.
It's
right?
a start now thing.
Yeah.
You got to start now. You don't wait till you get to that age and then start doing these habits. These are habits that create preventative. You know, so out of all this conversation, what I'm hearing is like, not only when you take rest as serious as you take your work, and you do these activities, and by the way, like you said, Alex, then you can get better at all of them. So they're all skills. These are all skills that you can get better at. You not only increase your productivity, so you're going to have more results in your career, you're going to actually live a longer life and more sustainably, right? Because you're going to have that, you're going to actually have a more fulfilling life because you're going to have all these other activities, your family. And there's more in there, but I mean, those three right there, I think, wow, it's like what a better life you can enjoy just by doing this. And so I hope that this conversation just invites people to try these things, and you can just do one at a time. Just try one of these activities that you put in your book and start having a difference in your life. And then it really, you know what I found, there's something, and I don't know if you found this in your work now that you wrote this book, you know, you started working on this over a decade ago. It didn't occur to me when I started working on More Business, More Life, how much it would impact the world in other ways, the ripple effect. And, you know, as like being a better neighbor, being better civically, like, you know, someone else came up to me and they're like, I did all these things you said, Steve, and my business is better and I have a better life, but I actually know my neighbors now. I didn't even know any of them. I drove in my garage and I went in the house. So like there are other ripple effects. So I guess for my last question, are there any ripple, like, so now that you've got this decade, you're having the second edition come out, is there a ripple that you didn't think about and that you notice now from those?
You know, in a way that one of the things that the companies that I've worked with the last few years have taught me is that, you know, we often think of sort of the pursuit of rest or leisure or better life as something that we do ourselves, right? In a way, it's a sort of maximization, you know, a sort of optimization problem, just like all other optimization problems. And it turns out that's not really complete. That, you know, 4-day week companies have shown me that the most enduring sorts of solutions to problems of work-life balance, solutions to the question of how do we bring more time for rest into our lives, are things that we can pursue even more effectively if we're able to do them with other people rather than in competition with or sort of despite others. That, you know, and that, you know, we don't just bring benefits of more rest to our families or to our colleagues or clients, but sort of they can help us also sort of rest better and create a sort of virtuous circle. And that ultimately, you know, but also doing those things with others is itself inherently satisfying and I think sort of even more sustainable. And it turns out, in a sense, that, you know, we are all on a quest to have better lives, or to, you know, or to take better care of ourselves. And it turns out that collective action is a really potent form of self-care. And so, you know, that's the one other really big thing that I've learned about rest recently.
Well, you know, and they study a lot in the blue zone. If you know those longevity,
right?
That community was a huge part to those blue zones. That they knew that they were going to be taken care of by their neighbors. You know, that they, you know, because it takes a stress level that, you know, we do have in modern society where it's like, this is my problem, this is my house. And then when you have that community, like that takes an extra edge of stress away and many other things like you're talking about. it's so beautiful. And even this, as you're saying that, it's like even this collaboration, you and I at some point in life could have thought, oh, this is a competitive thing. Like Steve's saying more business, more life. And you're saying this, and here we are both embracing each other with total different sets of skills. Your skill set is totally different than mine. We have a similar theme and desire for the world. And this collaboration, we both heighten each other up because it's here. So it's just beautiful. I welcome future conversation. I know you're working on your next book, and I'm amazed to see that come through, especially because you're going to start to write about music now. And for me in my life, as I've given more time, I learned the Native American flute, and I've now been learning piano and learning to read music. Wow. And you also inspired me in this conversation because I was thinking about what I want to do with my next sabbatical, and I think about work, or I think about my company and how we're helping people. But I think I'm going to do a piano sabbatical. I don't know when I'm going to do it, if I'm going to do it for a month or something, but like something like a month or 3 months. And I just, put 4 hours a day into piano because I haven't done that. Like I'll get a piano lesson and then I'll try. My goal is 10 minutes a day. I wonder what would happen if I did 3 months with 4 hours of piano a day. That would be amazing. Just what a treat. Yeah. So anyway, you inspired me today. I just wanted you to know that. And I look forward to your next book, especially since music is becoming a bigger part of my life. So I look forward to that. And I appreciate you coming on the show. It's been a treasure.
Oh, thank you, Steve. Yeah. No, it's been a great pleasure for me too. So, and a lovely venue to work in. Yeah. So that's been an extra treat. But no, it's been great to talk.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for listening and watching. We pour our hearts into these episodes, and we have More Business, More Life, the newsletter that's free. And so if you are on our newsletter, and please reply to our newsletter and tell us what the greatest value that you got from this interview with Alex. And we reply to those. So we actually listen to what you say. And if you're not on the newsletter, all you have to do is text WOW, WOW, to 72,000. So it's 72000 72000, and then you can it'll prompt you to join our newsletter, and it's free. And then you'll get all of our latest episodes, and you can interact with us. Please do reply. We love that. And if you have questions or something, and we can we'll have the contact info, so you can get in touch with Alex as well, so that you can learn more. Or if there's something you want us to talk about in the future, we're here for you. I'm passionate about this, and so that's why we have More Business, More Life. So thank you so much for listening in. So here we are. This is what we've been talking about, and this was your third book, right, Alex? So Rest was his third book. He's working on his sixth book right now. So go look up his all the different books, because they're all at this level of story and data. And this is very meaningful for me. It gave a lot of the data and some of the things that I've been speaking about for years, but then now I have more backing because I have this book. So I'm going to keep this on my shelf because I'm like, wait, there's a study here. I'm going to prove what I'm talking about. Here it is on this page. That's the type of book it is. So I can't say enough about it. And that's why I decided to have Alex here. Alex Soojung-Kim Pang. But it's spelled Pang. We talked about this. People go P-A-N-G. Thank you so much for being on the show, Alex. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, yeah. Thanks for listening to the More Business, More Life podcast. I hope you got value. And if you did, we have so many more things for you at stevenapolitan.com. You'll be able to connect with us on social media. We are active. You can ask us questions. I look forward to having you on the next show. Until then, remember, choose gratitude and create freedom.